Hello, friends, and welcome to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, an ADHD woman with EDS, POTS, complex PTSD, and OCD, shaped by an abusive religious upbringing. I spent much of my life feeling like I was balancing precariously over an endless pit, constantly reaching for a stable home that always seemed just out of reach. Today, I can honestly say that home is wherever I am right now, built on the stable ground that's growing out of a deepening relationship with my body and myself. In this podcast, I share the lived experiences that brought me here, in case it helps someone feel less alone or supports them on their own journey home. Since I approach this show from the perspective of an autistic woman, I figured it was time to have an episode dedicated to the unique intersection of sexism and what I've seen referred to as autistophobia or autistic bias, or anti-autistic bias, I should say. Since I've mostly experienced this in the workplace setting, this is the lens I'll be using to examine it. I think that language is important, and there are so many words out there to describe discrimination against disabled people, neurodivergent people, autistic people, etc. But I'm attempting to choose the words that specifically focus on autistic women, right? So, like, misogyny and sexism are anti-woman bias, and then ableism is kind of a more broad term, but I'm trying to focus specifically on um, autism specifically because I do think that there is a very particular um, discrimination that happens at the intersection of autistic and female. So that's why I'm using autistophobia, which is actually, I was only able to find one article, which I will link in the show notes, that uses that word. It's very interesting that there actually aren't a lot of words specifically that I can find, at least, specifically meaning bigotry towards autistic people. There's like neuronormativity, which is the idea that the neurotypical brain is superior. Um, but obviously that encompasses all, bias against all neurodivergent identities. So it is interesting that there's not a lot of autistic specific language. And what there definitely isn't a lot of, if any, are words to describe anti-autistic female bigotry, like that specific intersection. So I found one, I think it was a Medium article, which I will also link in the show notes, that does coin a word, although I haven't seen it used anywhere else, but I did kind of like it, and it was misogyny, but instead of an O, it's an AU. And I thought that was very interesting. And in the article, she specifically says that this autistic woman says that she was inspired by the term misogynoir, right, which is bigotry against Black women. So I like that word. And what I'm mainly talking about today is how I came to understand that my lifelong workplace conflicts were not just sexism, but the intersection of sexism and anti-autistic bias, or misogyny. It's kind of pronounced the same. Um, and I realized this after recognizing, of course, that I was autistic. And I will also say that in the article, she says that it's intentional that they sound the same, because a lot of times the autistic identity of the woman is invisible. I don't know, I feel like I need to read the article again to really understand what she's trying to point out. But I do think that is an interesting take on it, that a lot of times, as I wasn't, autistic women aren't diagnosed. And so the autistic part, but yet the people that you are interacting with are reacting to your autistic way of being. It's just they don't know it and you don't know it, if that makes sense. So Allistic women definitely face systemic gender bias, of course, such as pay gaps, glass ceilings, microaggressions, and expectations around emotional labor, balancing work and caregiving, and gendered communication norms, but without additional neurodivergent complexity. And that is already quite a lot of systemic gender bias. Research on neurotypical women shows barriers including hostile or benevolent sexism, lack of recognition, imposter syndrome, and challenges with work life balance shaped by sociocultural expectations. And then autistic women encounter not only gender bias, but also challenges tied specifically to autistic traits. Difficulty with unspoken social rules, decoding implicit communication, sensory overload, and social interaction demands embedded in workplace cultures. These intersect, though, with the expectations, because of course, like autistic men also encounter those um, neurotype biases, right? But these neurotype biases, these and autistic behaviors, intersect with expectations placed on women to conform to, quote, feminine social behaviors, right? Because feminine social behaviors are just a social construct. Um, this results in masking or camouflaging, where the autistic woman pretends to be allistic, that contributes to burnout, identity strain, and underestimation of abilities. Autistic women face, of course, disproportionately high underemployment and unemployment, heavier cognitive and social loads in navigating workplace dynamics, and structural barriers in hiring practices that emphasize ambiguous um, social norms. I have seen it referred to in some places as like double masking, because as a woman, you have to perform um, to the patriarchal gaze, but then as an autistic person, you have to perform to the neurotypical standards. And I am white, so I don't have experience with like code switching or having to perform to the white gaze. But I'm sure that for like an autistic woman of color, then there would be, or even just, an allistic woman of color, there would be that extra factor of masking or performing to a certain gaze as well. So, as a result of recognizing that my lifelong workplace conflicts were not just sexism, but sexism and autistophobia, or the broader misogyny, trying to emphasize the awe part of it to differentiate it. Um, Once I realized that, I shifted from blaming myself or seeing my struggles as isolated incidents to recognizing them as systemic bias, which clarified to me why I reacted the way I did and why workplaces often pushed me out. My entire life, I've had a chip on my shoulder, and I've been told that I have a chip on my shoulder, and I've been told that, like, things would just go so much better if you just weren't so angry and didn't have such a chip on your shoulder. But that chip is there because I experienced misogyny, and for the record, every time I say that now, I'm going to be referring to the AU misogyny. I had that chip due to experiencing misogyny without understanding the autistophobia piece of it. Not knowing I was autistic, but sexism not quite being enough to explain my experiences. So I felt like I was being mistreated for no reason. And don't get me wrong, I'm still angry now that I know this. Um, but at least now I have an explanation for what type of discrimination I was and am experiencing. Because other women identified with some of my experiences, but not specifics, like being literally unable to keep quiet in the face of injustice, not understanding the emotional connotation of words, or feeling especially singled out by male coworkers in a way that felt like the sick baby animal being separated from the herd. Like, I know that a lot of women experience sexual harassment in the workplace for sure. I do think that predators of that sort are more likely to go after the specifically the woman who seems extra vulnerable or like an outcast and that sort of thing. So I often felt like I, in particular, was kind of singled out sometimes by some men, and I felt uncomfortable in a way that sometimes the other women didn't quite understand. So I would end up especially confused when interacting with male coworkers who communicated in similarly direct and assertive ways as came naturally to me. Um, Male coworkers who frequently interrupted and talked a lot in meetings, and yet they were held to a completely different standard than I was. And that very much confused me because it felt like I had to change my natural communication style and they did not. Which is true. I mean, that's not just what it felt like, that is the truth. I just didn't understand it at the time. In my mind, misogyny is the particularly intense penalty that women incur when their natural behavior, mannerisms, and communication style align more with the societal label of masculine rather than feminine. Autistic traits are seen as so masculine coded that there was even a time where autism was postulated to be the quote extreme male brain. So when a woman shows up to work and unconsciously behaves in ways that the patriarchy associates with men, she threatens the patriarchal order of the workplace and is often quite aggressively put in her place. And I also want to say, of course, I think these ideas have a wider applicability. I, again, am specifically sharing this from a white autistic woman perspective. But I also think that this patriarchal double standard applies to like women of color or lesbians, like people who are um, not just a woman, but have other marginalizations that cause them to be like double penalized in the workplace and where it like intersects with the femaleness in such a way that it's like more than twice the penalty, I feel like. I don't know if that's I don't know if that makes any sense. I just feel like um the AU misogyny is feels like more than just the addition of autistophobia and uh, the regular misogyny added together. It feels like a compounding. And again, I don't have the experience of like a woman of color, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a similar feeling of it's compounding, right? The racism and the sexism compounding on top of each other. So, what now for the crux of the episode? What did I do about this? Or what can we do about this? And I'm specifically looking at this from the perspective of nervous system regulation and making home in your own body. Of course, there are probably a lot of things that we could do in terms of systemic change, such as something I would like to do is get neurotype specifically um, encoded as a protected class in the same way that gender is. And what I mean by that, I know that ableism, like disability, is already a protected class, right? So ableism is already theoretically illegal, although the ADA is only as good as the lawyers that you can afford to hire to enforce it. So, but I think there is an issue remaining, which is that you have to disclose your disability or there has to be some way to prove that the employer could have reasonably believed that you were disabled, right? Like maybe you use a wheelchair. So you could say, okay, well, they saw me in a wheelchair. So they probably could have made that assumption. I don't know. I don't know if that would hold up in court. I feel like the bar for winning ADA complaints is like super high, or discrimination, workplace discrimination complaints. But the thing is though, with gender discrimination, you don't have to say, "Oh, yes, I disclosed to my boss that I am a woman." It's generally assumed that they will assume you are a woman by looking at you. The point I am trying to make is that allistic people unconsciously register the autistic that the autistic person is different. But it feels like the autistic person gets penalized for not having disclosed why they were different, if that makes sense. I'm getting very far off track. I'll just summarize. I think that if neurotype was a protected class in the sense of if someone could if someone even just experiences your autistic communication style and discriminates against you because of it, then that should count as discrimination, even if they didn't know you were autistic, even if you didn't know you were autistic. Okay, I'm not a legal scholar. I have no idea the actual feasibility of that. Let's get back to the actual episode. So, what did I do? This realization pushed me to emotionally detach from workplaces that demand conformity and instead find meaning in spaces where my natural communication style and sense of justice and such do not have to be suppressed. Of course, I cannot completely detach. Well, I'm working on it. This podcast is part of me attempting to somehow um, support myself in a way that doesn't involve traditional work, but ultimately that may not work. Not everybody can fully detach from such workplaces. But I do think that there's a way to emotionally detach while still doing what you gotta do in order to have money for food and rent and such. Many experiences of being put in my place via things like being denied a better job, being asked to resign, being fired. Yes, all of these things have happened to me. These experiences left me quite angry. And the more angry I got, the more I would speak out and experience the same repeated consequences. Hence the like chip on my shoulder thing. Since then, I've detached emotionally, but the anger remains. Like I'm detaching emotionally from the workplace, but the anger is still there because the anger is my anger, if that makes sense. I'm angry that such a particularly vulnerable group, autistic women, who have, um, I've heard it as a 50% suicide attempt rate and a 90% sexual assault rate, and other very disheartening statistics. I'm angry that this group is so often pushed out of the very place that would provide its members with safety and agency, right? Money. In capitalism, as much as it sucks, and I wish it were not this way, money and employment are safety and agency. And just to talk about those statistics briefly, there is a Embrace Autism article that mentions the suicide attempt rate of 50%. They don't cite their statistic though, which I am not a fan of. So I tried to find some sources myself. I found a Danish suicide study, and I will link that in the show notes, with the conclusion that autistic people had a more than threefold higher rate of suicide attempts, not success, but attempts. Among autistic people, the women were 4.41 times more likely than the autistic men to attempt suicide. And among the non autistic people, the women were only 1.41 times more likely than the non-autistic men to attempt suicide. These are all at 95%. They have 95% confidence intervals, um, which you can go look them up if you'd like. Right, they have like a range around that number quoted, which is the 95% confidence interval for anyone who's interested in the more exact statistics of this study. And I do very much like that they have confidence intervals and they state what the sample size is, I think, and all of those things. And it's a high sample size. But just for Denmark, um, I did get a little bit confused because I thought that men in general had higher suicide rates, but I believe it's that men in general succeed at suicide more often than women because they tend to use more violent methods, but women attempt it at a higher rate, whether autistic or not. But anyway, today is the day of sidetracks. The whole point of that was to provide some sort of actual cited statistics on the fact that autistic women have a particularly high rate of suicide attempts compared to both autistic men and allistic women. And the 90% sexual assault statistic, I believe, comes from a French study, which I will also link in the show notes. It found that 88.4%, which I guess tends to get rounded up to 90%, of autistic women in this study, with a sample size of 255, which is maybe a little bit low, but they had suffered sexual violence starting in um, 2/3 before the age of 18. That's phrased a little bit confusing. 2/3 of this 88.4% had experienced sexual violence before the age of 18. So this 88.4% is compared to 27% of the general female population. Okay, there we go. Those are the um, statistics that I could find with the sources. Okay, back on track. With the election of Trump and his defunding of science, my field has been reducing hours, furloughing, and laying off many workers. Many employers seem to treat these sorts of situations as unfortunate but necessary, putting a good face on it and reminding employees that everything will be fine. For the people at the top, at least, is how I see it. But to me, in capitalism, a matter of employment is not simply a matter of employment. For many vulnerable groups, it is a matter of basic survival. So, one way of emotionally detaching for me is to stop believing that narrative and to just see things for how they are. To see it as like, no, I refuse to believe that these matters of employment are just matters of employment, when they are, in fact, a lot of times matters of survival, right? To remember these statistics that, like, autistic women have high rates of suicide and sexual assault, and that these discriminatory workplaces, in my opinion, contribute to that by pushing autistic women out and causing them to be more economically and socially vulnerable. And again, I believe this can be generalized, right? Like, I believe the research shows that Black women are the lowest earners of any combination of race and gender, right? Um, so you could also argue that these discriminatory workplaces are making Black women more vulnerable. So I think this episode is getting a bit long. So I think I'm actually going to cut it and do a part 2 where I go a little bit more in depth into how to emotionally detach when you have to keep working at these places, and like I'm currently applying to stupid jobs that I don't really want to do, but I have to apply to them to get unemployment insurance and such. Um, and eventually, hopefully, start making money again in some fashion. But like when it's kind of baked into your life for survival, how do you emotionally detach when you are actively angry because you are actively being discriminated against and being treated like a problem and being um brainwashed? How do you resist this brainwashing of thinking that it's your fault? How do you resist that narrative and continue to hold in mind that this is not some isolated incident where I'm being a problem. This is systemic bias, and I am far from the only one experiencing it. So, stay tuned for next week when I will talk a bit more about how I started emotionally detaching. As we come to the end of this episode, I want to thank you for spending this time with me. If anything in this episode resonated with you and you'd like to share a thought, reflection, or bit of feedback, you're very welcome to email me. And if this podcast feels supportive or meaningful to you, I'd appreciate it if you left an honest review or shared it with someone who might also find it helpful. That's how this work finds the people that it's meant for. You've been listening to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, and I wish you a safe journey home.